Deep conversations with Uli Baer on big ideas and great books. Welcome to Think About It, or welcome back to this episode on philosopher Immanuel Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment? Before I introduce the episode, I just want to let you know that this episode is also available on YouTube, so you can watch the video recording of my conversation with my guest about Kant's philosophy. It's available under my name on YouTube, as are many of the other episodes on the great books that I discuss in this podcast. Immanuel Kant was born in 1724 and died in 1804, and is known as inaugurating or ushering in what is considered modern philosophy. His books include the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Practical Reason, and the Critique of Judgment, which, as their titles say, are the attempts to understand the relationship between reason and experience, and the pure reason, practical reason in what we do and why we should do it, and the Critique of Judgment, which looks at aesthetics and teleology, or why we do things with what goals in mind. He also published the Metaphysics of Morals and several other books. He was born in Königsberg, which is today Kaliningrad in today's Russia, and back then was part of Prussia on the Baltic Sea. He famously never left Königsberg at all, but taught at the university for decades, for the first 20 years, while getting paid by each individual student if his lectures were good, which means that he talked about a huge range of subjects, which today we would classify as anthropology, history, sociology, politics, philosophy, metaphysics, alchemy, biology, etc. But what he's known for is really the Critique of Pure Reason and the other critiques that usher in what I called modern philosophy, because they try to define and identify what we do when we think and how we think and what we think about on its own terms, without relying on any outside or external causes or cases. I talked to Béatrice Longuenesse, who's Silver Professor of Philosophy at NYU, where I also teach. I was thrilled that Béatrice had time out of her busy schedule, she lectures all over the world, to talk about Kant's philosophy. She studied in Paris at the École Normale Supérieure and at the Sorbonne, and also at Princeton, where she also taught before coming to NYU. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has published many books, among them Kant and the Capacity to Judge, Kant on the Human Standpoint, and her most recent publication with the wonderful title I, Me, Mine, Back to Kant and Back Again, which examines what it means to speak from the position of the I, my personal subjective viewpoint, in ways that must be relevant for others. I was thrilled to have Béatrice join me for the podcast to understand the significance of this short essay, What is Enlightenment?, which Kant published in response to a newspaper article, essentially as a footnote to explain what is enlightenment, what does it mean for us to think ourselves, and in this short essay established not only the entire age of reason in which we still live today, but also, as Béatrice explained to me, lays out, essentially in a very short and brief and concise way, his entire philosophy. So please join me for the podcast now with Béatrice Longuenesse on Immanuel Kant's What is Enlightenment? So, Béatrice, I'm really so happy to see you here. First of all, thank you for joining me on Think About It.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is very exciting for me too.
So, Béatrice, you're a professor of philosophy, and you have said, I've heard this in one of your talks, that Kant is your philosophical hero. Mm-hmm. So you've devoted a lot of time to think with Immanuel Kant, sort of, who really inaugurates what we consider modern philosophy today. And then I ask you to think about this little tiny text in this huge corpus of what is enlightenment. It's a sliver of Kant, really. And maybe we can start there. It's such a small little way into this major edifice.
Yeah, it's quite amazing, actually, because it is indeed one of Kant's, if not the text of Kant's, that is most discussed today.
Right.
And it started almost contingently. So there was this throwaway question in a footnote to an article in the Berliner Monthly, Berlinische Monatsschrift, where actually a defender of the Enlightenment Zöllner, responded to an earlier article which was really going too far, he thought, in applying the principles of the Enlightenment, and said, and by the way, nobody has ever been able to tell me what exactly Enlightenment is.
Right.
And that generated a whole slew of answers from all sorts of people, most of them more obscure than Kant. One of them just as famous as Kant, Mendelssohn,
right.
And then an answer from Kant. And that answer, then sort of mushroomed, partly, of course, because the question, what is Enlightenment, also touched on what was central to Kant's system. But this text doesn't really make use of Kant's more systematic thought. Mm-hmm. Initially, the purpose of the article is to defend freedom of thought, right. And in particular to defend freedom of thought against the attempts on the part of religious conservatives to encroach upon it.
Right.
So initially when Kant says, Enlightenment is the emergence of humanity out of its state of immaturity, and its major motto is think for yourself.
Right.
The first meaning is think of yourself against the attempt of any authority, and especially religious authority, to think for you. Nobody should be thinking for you, you should be thinking for yourself.
And it's a way, it's not really a call to action, but he says this is what human beings are meant to do.
This is right? Behind this, there is a very general view of there's a kind of teleological principle behind human history. Yeah. Given their capacities, given the capacities they all share, mm-hmm. They're all called upon mm-hmm. to develop the capacity to think for themselves, develop their reason. But that Kant immediately adds, that takes courage. It doesn't go right. by itself. It doesn't depend just on their reason, it depends on their courage, a moral
when we leave the reason apart, that's a lot of your work is on this. How do we actually think? What are the conditions for our own thought? This is the other large part of Kant, the real, let's say the main work. But right. in this work, when he says courage, why do we hesitate to think for ourselves? And I think for me, this mm-hmm. question is so interesting because mm-hmm. we're in a university, I'm doing a podcast. The whole point is think for yourself, which is right. such an obvious thing. And then right. your work focuses on all the other Kant. It's actually not simple. Yeah. And then, but you just said it requires courage. Why don't we just all want to do this?
So I think, again, in all fairness, both to Kant and to ourselves, we need to put that issue of courage in its context for Kant. Yeah. Namely, for Kant, this is a very specific historical moment. It's actually important to realize that Kant was capable of thinking about his own specific historical moment. Yeah. This is the reign of Frederick the Great. It comes after Frederick William I, right. who was not as enlightened as Frederick the Great, right. And had actually impinged, limited religious freedom. Then comes Frederick the Great, who really endorses religious freedom, but Kant was very aware of how fragile that was. So why don't we all want to think for ourselves in Kant's time? Well, because it was not that either politically or religiously or socially easy. Yeah. How does that question then generalize to Kant's system? Well, we human beings are always occupying a particular standpoint. Okay. That's how we're born into a particular standpoint. And it's very difficult, it's not obvious to grow out of that particular standpoint and occupy a standpoint from which we can, as he says elsewhere, think putting ourselves in the place of anybody else. In fact, here he says, think for ourselves. The motto is developed more fully in Kant's third critique, the Critique of Judgment, where he says, actually, there are three basic maxims of enlightenment. Think for yourself, think putting yourself in the place of anybody else, and think consistently. And if you think about it seriously, they actually all complete each other. Thinking for yourself is not just thinking from your particular standpoint. So, I'm a French person, or I'm a German, or I'm a Jew, or it's thinking using your reason, and reason is a universally shared capacity.
So we all have the same sort of starting position. We all can make use of our reason. That's the first one. Think
Well,
for
we
yourself.
all have both the same starting position.
Yes.
We're rational.
Yes. Yeah,
and
we're
we all
rational.
have
Okay.
different starting positions.
Right.
We do think from
Very-
particular
yes.
educational
Yeah.
backgrounds, particular societies,
Sure.
and so
Yeah.
on. That's why it's so difficult.
Yeah.
We have to navigate constantly the tension between those two meanings, as it were.
So that's the first one, think for yourself. The second one is think from the position of somebody else.
Yeah, of anybody else.
And these are interlinked. So this is the second point he makes in the
Right.
third critique.
Yeah, yeah.
And how do we do that?
So actually, here's the interesting point too. In a way, it has already happened, thinking from this, or at least we've already been given the tools for that. That Kant's famous appeal to the Copernican Revolution in
Which
the preface to his first critique.
He himself says, I am initiating...
I am going to initiate in philosophy what has already been done in science.
When Copernicus recenters the universe from not us to the sun.
Right.
He said we revolve around the sun and we are in movement.
Right. But yeah, and that actually, that's a more complex thought than one might think. Because what the Copernican Revolution actually initiated, the idea, the way we most immediately see things depends not on the way they are, but on the standpoint we occupy with respect to them. So for instance, it seems obvious that planets revolve around the Earth. But once you realize that the Earth itself revolves around the sun, then you realize that the apparent motion of the planets, for us, depends on a moving standpoint we ourselves occupy.
Right.
And Kant says, well, we have to think more generally that the way we think depends on capacities we have that are universally shared.
Okay.
And what those capacities that we universally share allow us to understand is how at any given time our immediate standpoint is relative, particular.
To whatever we are reflecting on or acting on
or whatever
thinking about.
Position we ourselves are in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the second plus, so even assuming the other's position is not as easy.
Right.
Which is interesting because it's such a common thing today.
Yeah.
Or think how other people think or take the position of somebody else. For Kant, that's not a simple thing, but we're capable of it.
We're capable of it. And of course, to think, putting ourselves in the place of anybody else is not adopting their standpoint.
Yeah.
It's just understanding, okay, how do our respective standpoints communicate?
Yeah, yeah.
And how by assessing the difference in those standpoints can we arrive at an objective standpoint? A standpoint that would hold for all.
So it's kind of a triangulation, so I'm thinking, so we're looking at the same table here, the same cameras, the same room, but you're looking at it from a different position. And in this, do I think about your position both just physically in space, but also who you are? Do I try to imagine all of that as well?
Right.
So how you would see this, and I think I look at it this way, you may think of it that way.
Right.
We could
exactly. So in the case of this table, it's fairly easy because we're not that far from one another.
Right.
The table belongs to our common physical space. It's already more complicated in the case of science.
Yes.
So science is a very good model because in the case of science, you know that you've reached as objective a standpoint as you're able to reach at a certain point in the development of science when you're capable of understanding a particular phenomenon or a particular event under a universal law.
Okay.
And that is what it is not to believe something to be true because you're being told it's true, but because you understand it under a universal law. So here's a simple example. I may have been worried I was worried about everything when I was a child, I still am. But for instance, Mommy, isn't the moon going to fall on the earth? No, it's not going to fall on the earth. And I just believe her because I love her, because I trust her. And then at some point, I learned the law of inertia, I learned the law of universal gravitation, and I understand why the moon is not going to fall on the earth.
I'm trying to follow you and I'm thinking, I didn't know the law of inertia yet. I'm trying to think, why is it actually this way? You just gave me a cause for alarm. I think,
well, because, so the moon gravitates around the earth. That's a very famous example. The pear falls from the tree.
Yeah.
Both according to the law of universal gravitation, but in the case of the moon, because in addition, so it's subject to that law, but also to the law of inertia.
So it keeps on
that
moving
counters
on
that it keeps it
elliptical
moving around the earth.
So you now have a shared understanding based on objective
right.
rules or laws.
I have a universal law both from an objective standpoint. So these different phenomena actually obey the same law.
Yeah.
And I also know that any other human being, so that's another sense in which it's universal. It's objectively universal.
Yeah.
It can also be understood as universal by any other human being that has been taught the law,
so
taught the reason for the validity of the law, and can exercise the reason.
And the third part, you said the reasoning has to be consistent or follow a certain kind of pattern. You have to be able to reconstruct. And so you...
Yeah. And also, again, if I encounter phenomena that seem to contradict each other, like the falling of the pair and the gravitation of the moon around the Earth, I may think, okay, no, there's something wrong there. No. And I understand why there's an additional law.
Okay. So this is an important part. So to go back to this, it's not you just accept this because someone tells you. That would mean not thinking for yourself. He uses really kind of sort of paralyzing examples. If you hand over all authority for your own life to everybody else, the doctor tells you how to eat, someone else tells you what to believe in, someone else tells you what to think, you're not thinking for yourself, right? Although, of course, we should talk about expertise. You want some experts to tell you certain things, right? He doesn't say throw all this out.
Right.
So the other two parts are very important. So when a doctor tells you something, you can say, I can follow the logic of this because I know there are rules that this doctor, she applied. And thirdly, there's a consistency in which they've been applied.
Right.
So he doesn't quite unfold all of this here. He just says,
no, he doesn't
think for yourself.
That's why, he just says think for yourself. And what does that mean, think for yourself? Because it might mean, well, I'm just going to think according to my culture, or I'm just going to think according to what I've been taught. And that's not what and that would be a way of focusing on yourself as this particular person at this particular time in this particular community. And that's not what he means. He means, no, think for yourself means using a reason that is yours, a capacity that is what most fundamentally characterizes you as a human being. And then you can share that with others.
And this part, it characterizes you as a human being. He says this is the essence of what it means to be human, right? To be able to use reason to shape your understanding of your sense impressions or of you seeing the world. You're able to use reason, right? And he also says that you have to use reason. It's an obligation almost. I'm kind of interested in...
So that is really the interesting point. So in fact, this idea that, okay, you're using your reason if you understand something, not just as this particular event or this particular case, but under a universal principle. He extends that not just to understanding what exists, but understanding what I ought to do.
Okay.
And there it's a much more complicated. That's where issues of community come in much more forcefully.
Right.
But what I ought, he includes under what I ought to do the obligation I have, the moral obligation I have to be objective about what is, about facts, and to accept laws for my own action only if I can accept that others would give them to themselves as well. So there are those two aspects.
What you can know and what you have to do. So the link between reason and what we call morality, I guess. In common
morality and political choices, social obligations one acknowledges to others, limitations one acknowledges to be necessary on one's own free-willing activity.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is the other part. This is the categorical imperative, which I think is the other thing that a lot of people know about Kant. It's sort of the two things they take. Sort of it's Enlightenment, categorical imperative, and then you're kind of then it gets really difficult. So then you leave it to philosophy. But what you just said, that it's a rule that others could apply as well.
Yeah.
Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law.
I wanted to say something about the case of the medical doctor because I find it really, really amusing when one knows a little bit about Kant. Because Kant was very, very concerned about his own health. And it's very interesting. I mean, those little throwaway remarks, you have to consider them in context. Kant was not of very good physical health, and he didn't leave it to anyone. He probably did see doctors, but when he says, I'm not going to leave it to them to decide for me, he took his regular walk. He was very careful about what he ate. In a way, he anticipates what is today a very common, just live properly.
Self-care, right?
Yeah, self-care.
Well, he's famous. I mean, I grew up with these, I don't know if they are true or not, or apocryphal, but that he took this constitutional walk every day.
So it's not clear whether it was really him, whether it was a legend or his friend Green. He had a very good friend, Green, English, who came regularly to visit him, taught him Hume.
Oh, really?
And it's not clear whether it was Kant who took the constitution, or maybe they both took it together.
But they said you could set your watch or your clock by the time Kant took his walk, and everything was this rhythmic kind of. I also think there's this kind of incredible productivity, because he was teaching full time for decades.
That was the regime for German.
And then he wrote these books which have really revolutionized the way philosophy can think about itself. Right? This is what this contribution is. So when he says. It's very easy for others to establish themselves as the guardians, as those who think for us. So some people realize that it's not easy for us that we want to think for ourselves.
Right.
And maybe we don't want to.
Yeah.
That there's also this kind of temptation to say, it's not, what you just laid out, it's not as simple as it seems. So some people shrink away from it. And I think there's this kind of, this is what's so interesting about this text, it's this kind of admonition to humanity.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean be yourself, be human.
Right.
Which means you have to think for yourself.
Right. And of course, for Kant, it all boils down to being free. So why should I think for myself? Because that is what it is to be free. Any other freedom, and it's not the only freedom, but any other freedom will depend on that.
Okay.
And in fact, that comes up at the end of the text when, he's a little bit too, I think, accepting of Frederick's more authoritarian tendencies. But at the end he says, look, once human beings have been trained to think for themselves, then they will also be able to demand self-government in a political sense. Why think for yourself? Because it's not just that it's in human nature to be rational, it's that human beings think about it. What they want is to be free. And what is it to be free? It's first to think for yourself. And then everything else can come into the...
But that's probably the most powerful sort of idea in this little text, that when human beings think for themselves, they want to be free. That freedom is the essence. I don't know if that's the right word philosophically speaking, but it's kind of innate to us to be free.
Right.
And he also says in a way, we don't have to be freed by anybody else. We will, in a sense, discover or realize our own freedom, right? It's not given to anybody. It's not coming from elsewhere. It's in... I don't know if the philosophical term would be, it's innate or in us.
So at least it's a capacity we have. So there too, Kant's thought is always more complex than one might think. That's also why it is so easy to attack, because you can draw this or draw that or draw that. So Kant has a very, and too often ignored, I think, developmental view of human capacities. So, or what he himself calls epigenetic. So there are, it's not that the developed human being is already there in germ, in the infant or in the baby or in the whatever he understood the in the womb entity to be, but it's that there are capacities that under the right external circumstances are apt to be developed. And so it's not that any human being is born with the will to be free. It's that any human being is born with the capacity to will to be free. And that is the same as her rational capacity.
Interesting. And are there conditions under which a human being couldn't get in touch with that capacity or couldn't develop it, or?
Yeah, I think. Well, certainly, and that's also what this text says. You need, so you first need guardians, namely legislators, external legislators, legislators in the political and juridical sense, that will create the conditions for human beings. And the first is religious freedom. That was such a present issue in 18th century Prussia, but also conditions to participate in the social debate and legislative decisions. But then there are darker issues that come up in other texts, not in this one, although you may see them in sort of under the lines here. For instance, I'm trying to remember. It's in a later text. This is 1784, 1788, I think. Kant's text on the teleological principles, where he says, well, there are populations, any human being. So he had a view of the universality of the capacities in human beings. But then there are populations which will grow in external circumstances such that they will not have developed their full capacity to rationality, or even their full capacity to general activity, capacity to be active. And he cites, unfortunately, he will then take this back, but in that text, he cites the African populations, which were initially came on Earth in circumstances of easy weather, general circumstances that did not help them develop their capacity to self-determination. And then they are forever, even when you transplant them, incapable of self-ruling. So he took it back then.
But so there's something in here. So this is kind of the great thing, one of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment. But this means that it shows up later on in Hegel in a different way, but sort of that Africans, in his view, which he knows about through colonial writings, I guess, stay in a childlike state or something like that. What you're saying, they don't reach this maturity, which he used as a term that we understand to make sense of your capacity for your realizing your own freedom. So in this is not in this text, but it's complicated because in the Enlightenment there's this promise that all of humanity can activate this potential for freedom. But I think this is what's interesting, that the text is still so powerful because it conditions the world today. I would say the entire world. Actually, it's not a Western concept, but it has been applied to everybody. But in it is also a problem that he said some people are maybe not quite ready for this, or will ever get ready for this, which I'm sure justifies the slave trade, slavery, and racism for 200 years. So you have that in there. So it's kind of interesting because if you go back to the first text, but then Kant says we all have the capacity for reason. Right. So anybody reading this text says, wait, you actually you universalize here all the time about the human, right?
And so the question is, then what do you challenge in Kant? Is it the claim that there's a capacity for universalizing, or is the misapplication
of his own
of his own claim?
Or a very profound blind spot in his own claim.
But in the latest text on these issues, 1795, Towards Perpetual Peace, he did come out against slavery. That was after the French Revolution and the French Revolution abolition of slavery. So there too, there's, even for Kant himself, there's a historical context for the correct application of his own principles.
I think why I'm asking this, because it's so interesting to read a text like this, and how do you account for it from today's perspective? What we said very early, said you have to actually, we're talking to Kant here in some ways. We're trying to make sense of his standpoint, right? We're putting ourselves in that position. And you're saying there's also historical contingencies. He changes in a way which is interesting. The French Revolution really changes him, right? As a world historical event, which is interesting when he's taught as a philosopher who deals with abstract conditions, categories for reasoning, but then history really intervenes. I also think it's nice that he's a philosopher who responds to a footnote in a monthly paper. It's sort of thinking of the great philosophers today, reading,
and this is not the view of Kant.
It's reading a Facebook post by somebody about an article in The Economist, and you say, I'm going to take this up and respond to what is our condition today.
Right.
I do want to ask you one thing about women in this text,
Oh, yeah.
because we talked about it really briefly, and it's kind of a strange moment.
And actually, you were more.
I was more forgiving.
Yeah, you're more forgiving than I was.
Not really
I'm a
forgiving,
woman.
let's say, but he says the guardians who
Yeah.
have so benevolently taken over the supervision of men have carefully seen to it that the far greatest part of them, of all men, including the entire fair sex, regard taking the step to maturity as very dangerous and not to mention difficult.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, is he saying, women have been taught to believe that it's very dangerous to think for yourself because it's just safer to have people think for you. And it's a little bit, to me, unclear as he doesn't say anything about women after this moment in this little text.
Yeah.
No,
actually, we did talk about this in our conversation, and you make me read this passage, which really infuriated me, indeed in a more forgiving way.
But it had infuriated you because it initially reads, he says, women don't have this capacity.
Yeah. Yeah,
And,
but what he's saying is that women have been even more disenfranchised than the rest of humanity.
Which is very interesting. He says women have been sold on this idea that they can't think for themselves. And he says we all have the capacity for freedom and to use our reason. We also all have the capacity to succumb to this temptation to have others think for us, right?
Yeah.
Right. So it's, and I think for women, he says they've all been. He doesn't then say, well, some women actually have not accepted this. And as you said, there are women at this moment, right, in history.
Yeah, and he does say the entire fair sex, so that in any case was not quite right even at his time.
Not empirically right, probably, right? Because you said there are women in France.
It's also that for us that is very, very contemporary, because today in philosophy we are rediscovering a whole slew of women philosophers who have been ignored in the canon. So
that's actually it's. I have this conversation a lot, and I've literally asked your colleagues of what I should read in terms of women in philosophy, and they say, well, there's Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill, and then they don't really mention Simone de Beauvoir because for many reasons, and then they're kind of done. That's the canon. And so the canon has one woman, Mary Wollstonecraft, and then John Stuart Mill, and that's it. So you're saying there are many more people?
Oh yeah, there are many more.
They're being discovered, but. So the Enlightenment is this this little text. I'm trying to think, is it this, I said earlier, an admonition, or is it sort of encouraging us to do this? And once we step out of our own immaturity, we have to then step into the Kantian enterprise and not just say, I'm thinking of myself and my opinion is the valid one. I have to think about it for myself, then imagine how you think of this same thing from your position, standpoint, perspective, etc., and use my capacity to understand how we arrive at this is it not a judgment at this not opinion, what would you say, or understanding?
Opinion, if it's considered as he says, subjectively determined and be determined by my particular circumstances, it would still be an opinion. But of course, it's not just that. So it's not just I can say my standpoint and your standpoint and maybe that, and be tolerant. It's that I can there's a normative judgment I can pass because I just have to activate them in myself. I do have principles available under which I can assess each of our standpoints.
Okay.
So in terms of objective knowledge, it's the principles he thinks he has justified in the Critique of Pure Reason, that under which then you can understand how scientific principles are possible, that we can come up with universal laws, such as the classic example for Kant would be Newton's universal laws of motion.
Right.
But there are also universal normative principles for action. So it's not just that there's my standpoint and your standpoint and their standpoint. It's that each standpoint can be assessed under what you were just mentioning earlier. For instance, the categorical imperative of morality. And the first very famous formulation of the categorical imperative of morality is never act except under a maxim that you could also will to be a universal law. The principle itself
never act, this is the first principle, so that's one of several, right? So let's say again what this is, never act.
Never act except under a maxim that you could also will to be a universal law.
Okay.
Now, the principle itself is not that easy to understand because You might think, okay, so whenever I adopt a maxim, then everybody else should adopt it as well, otherwise it's... No. It's that everybody should be able, should they wish to adopt it as well. So it's more a negative principle. And if that's not possible, then you should not adopt the maxim.
Oh, so and give me the distinction between everybody should be able to do it.
So
they don't
for
have
instance,
to do it. It's not.
So for instance, suppose I have an exam to prepare and I need for that exam to go borrow a book at the library. That's a pretty straightforward maxim. I need the book, I should go borrow the book. I need to prepare my exam. And now you ask, so could I also will that everybody else adopt that maxim? Yes, I could. It's not logically impossible. Of course, it's pragmatically complicated. If everybody wants the same book, then we have to find a solution. Well, we will find a solution. There will be a pragmatic resolution to that problem. Either we Xerox the book. I mean, now we know how to do that. There's the internet. We can upload the volume, etc. In contrast, if I think, okay, I've borrowed the book under the condition that I returned it by such and such a date. I'm not going to return it. I still need the book. Is that a maxim? It is possible that I accept everybody else should adopt. No, because it contradicts the very notion of making a promise. I made a commitment to return the book. The very concept of a promise is just negated. So it's impossible. So then I should not.
Then you should not do it.
Then I should not do it. So it's more, and actually, we pretty much function that way. That's also, so Kant gives this, it's not a complicated formula, but it's complicated to understand how it works. But actually the interesting fact is, that's pretty much how we all do. So if I borrowed the book and I decide not to return it, there is a kind of unease, a red light sort of lights up in my mind. Can I really do that?
And the unease is because do you think we have learned just to think, well, if everyone did that, then, someone else needs the book. It's not, there's a rule, I'm breaking a rule. So it's interesting what you just said, because actually that's what parents tell their children. What if everybody did that? And that is actually an application of that universal principle. And Kant says at the beginning of his first sort of entry into moral philosophy, the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, he says, I'm not teaching you anything you don't know. The common moral understanding does know that what is morally unacceptable is what does not heed that universal principle. It just doesn't have it clearly in view. And I'm just, what I'm doing is putting out there as a clearly formulated principle what more or less in an obscure way everybody knows. So why is it needed? Well, because if you don't put it clearly out there, then any sophist can come and try to corrupt. Because you can take any example and then you have an infinite amount of examples and this one, and you don't know what the rule, there's no principle. Are there other principles that he says in terms of what we ought to do?
So actually that same imperative has two other related formulations. One is never act except in such a way that you take humanity in yourself and in the person of everybody else, in your own person and in the person of everybody else, not only as a means, but also as an end in itself. And what does that mean? Well, it means, of course, we need to treat others as means. We always, in our everyday life, it's useful to me that there's a grocer right next door. It's a means for myself to get food when, easily when I need it. But you should never use other human beings, namely humanity in them, just as a means, but also as an end in itself, which is another way actually to formulate the first, namely, well, they too have a right to consent to the way I act.
But this is interesting, to the humanity in them, to recognize. So in some ways what we said earlier about how he, a few years later, makes this really offensive comment and kind of tragic comment in a way, because it inaugurates so much, where he says, but if you recognize the humanity in the other and don't use them only as a means to an end, but they are an end in themselves, meaning they cannot just become an instrument for what you want.
They cannot become an instrument, and they too have a right to decide what is the proper way to treat them.
Yeah. Okay.
So they too have a right to exercise their consent to the way, the common way of living is organized.
The word you just used, consent, is interesting. I saw this play a few days ago called Consent, and it's some 200, almost 30, 50 years later, and we're still grappling with that, whether everybody has a right to determine how they will actually be treated in society, whether everybody has a right to participate in this conversation, whether everybody can define themselves as an end rather than a means to something else. It's quite interesting how long. You said there's another principle at work.
The third is never act except in such a way that you, so I don't remember the exact formulation, but that you are a citizen in a kingdom of ends. So, and if you're a citizen in a kingdom of ends, it means that everyone else, that like you is a human being. The kingdom of ends is really the common realm of human beings as ends in themselves. That's the third formulation, which is actually related to this and to Kant's text in the philosophy of history. Namely, the goal is to arrive at a universal common legislation, not just internal, the moral law everyone gives to themselves, but external, the way humanity is legislated upon. And the basic principle for the legislation on human beings is that the freedom of one doesn't impinge on the freedom of others. Right. Which means there's constraint on one's own freedom, but it's a constraint others have to accept too, and the commonly accepted constraint is what preserves everybody's freedom.
My freedom allows me to think of what I want to do, what I ought to do, but I also, in this freedom, I have this capacity to imagine what you want to do and ought to do. And this is the limitation on my freedom, but it enables me to be human and also allows me to be recognized as human by you. So freedom isn't this open-ended thing in Kant, sort of we all become free to do whatever we want, but we awaken this other capacity that he puts at the center of this little text here to think for ourselves. So the thinking part in this, think for yourself, for you means also this moral dimension, that it's linked, and this is what Kant's project is in the critiques, is saying that it's not just abstract thinking, or I'm thinking about it's not what we consider knowledge.
No, it's not just knowledge, and it's not even primarily knowledge, it's primarily the way you govern yourself and others.
Right. In this text, it goes on, it's quite interesting. You said earlier there's freedom of religion, which is really central to him. And then he says this really strange distinction between the private and public use of freedom of expression. And as you know, I've thought a lot about freedom of speech. Everybody does, it seems. It's also one of those eternal topics that recur. And he says there's something quite interesting, how we're supposed to, why it's so important to exercise freedom of expression in a public way. Because it offers others the opportunity to be exposed to our thinking.
And also to expose our thinking to others. So there's a very interesting passage where he says, only a few have succeeded by cultivating their own minds in freeing themselves from immaturity and pursuing a secure course. But that the public should enlighten itself is more likely. So emerging out of the state of immaturity is not something we will do on our own. It's something we will do by the exercise of public debate. So it's not just that I will expose others to my views, it's that I will submit my views to others in public debate. It has those two dimensions.
And this is an interesting part. There's this caricature of Kant as sort of sitting in a study and writing and going to teach, but then actually he did engage in what we would call public debates quite a lot. The criticism to his work, he responded to it. He was in a very active way, as to the extent possible to him at this time, to respond to criticism, engage, and he was teaching all the time.
And he was teaching all the time.
All the time. the first 15 years, I think back then you weren't paid, and you had to every
he
student
was
paid you directly after the lecture.
Paid by the lecture, yeah.
And
then finally he gets a position in 1770. He was already top 56?
Yeah, 50 or something. Yeah.
No, 46. Yeah.
Right. But this idea that you have to put your thought out into the public, why isn't it just sufficient to think for yourself and sort of make up your, through the principles or the steps we just outlined? And why is that important? Is it because it should be tested, or it should be, you should refine it in this way, which is ultimately this John Stuart Mill argument, which is a little bit strange. He says, you should put this out there to have others engage with it.
I think so. I think, again, the small incremental views we have here get developed massively in the whole system. So, and this idea that it is by public debate that we will refine our views, I think is most clearly developed in the third critique, the critique of judgment, where Kant says, well, that's where he develops his idea of the common human understanding, sensus communis, the very famous notion of sensus communis. He says there are two aspects to it. There's the sensus communis logicus, namely the common sense where we make use of our logical capacities. Yeah. So we think consistently for ourselves, but we also learn to think consistently by confronting our views with those of others. And then there's this other mysterious notion of a sensus communis aestheticus, a sensible, a common sense that makes use of our our sensibility.
Yeah.
And there too, we refine our access to beautiful things by confronting our own sensibility to beauty to that of others. So I think the idea that it is by public debate that we will arrive at both a better intellectual understanding and a better sensibility to what the world has to offer, as it were, and what other human beings' creations have to offer, is really a fundamental part of Kant's view that we have capacities, but they will develop only under external circumstances that are favorable to their development.
Right, okay.
We don't develop just on our own. We develop in connection with the external circumstances, and essential to those external circumstances are the ways we communicate with others.
And this sensus communis, there's two parts. Is it the logic or logicus and aestheticus? The second one is the one that's interesting. When I think about that we should share our responses to, let's say, beautiful objects or experiences, something like that. And because I think that's for a lot of people really strange, because they say, well, I like this and you like this, and this is beautiful and then you don't think it's beautiful. Sort of like, what does he think happens in this moment? And it's quite interesting when you said much earlier, we all have this humanity, or we ought to recognize in others that they have their humanity as an end in itself. We all have probably this capacity for freedom. What do we all have this capacity to, first of all, to respond to beauty. That's already a big step to recognize everybody, all humans respond to beauty. Because I think there's so much talk today, what do you have in common, a shared humanity, but he actually wants to really understand what would that mean, a shared humanity. It's not a shared set of values. So
I think the response to beauty is really an interesting case, because here the idea is that we don't just have a rational capacity that's common to all. We also have the capacity to imagine, imagination, create visible, audible, smellable entities, reality, that we have, as it were, imagined from the free play of our own capacities and then put out there in the world as an expression of what we are. And that ends up being for Kant the first core of the way we communicate with each other. And I think it's very prescient, because if you think of the development of art, for instance, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the discovery of African art, out of faraway cultures and regions became essential to the development of Western art.
Right.
And Kant had foreseen, even though those arts come from such different communities, cultures, geographic conditions, they become an essential element of the sort of universalization of culture.
What's essential is that all human beings, all cultures have this capacity and urge for self-expression through beautiful, through the creation of beauty, which is not utilitarian, it's not a shared project to develop a society, but all cultures produce something. So what we're recognizing is this other culture produced something they value greatly, but not in the utilitarian sense, because it's beautiful to them. So this goes back to then I get a sense that they have a capacity that I have in myself, although I may not have the same response to it.
And initially the response will be very different.
Very different, right? Because I don't get it.
And in fact, Kant does give examples of that. You know, the young poet who will love his own poetry, and others tell him it's yucky, it doesn't have any value, and no. And then eventually either he will change his mind or they will change their mind.
Interesting.
And the question is, and how does that happen? Well, again, by talking. So you don't say, look, you say, but look at this and look at that and look how it works, and this is why I find it. And you will never, so Kant's view is, you will actually never exhaust an aesthetic experience just by explaining it, but you will go some way to putting others in a position to share it with you by communicating what it is you're seeing or what it is you're hearing or what it is, essentially what it is, the examples he gives are mostly poetry, visual arts, music.
It's nice the example is that the young enthusiastic poet who mistakes his own art for something amazing, or Kant has this category, he says, or he's a genius who gives the rule to his own art, and we don't understand anything.
Or actually, nature in him.
Nature
so it's
in him.
Something he doesn't control. Nature in him gives the rule to his art.
So through this artist, nature imposes new rules, which we can't understand right now. Because, and this is also in our historical moment, this person will be misunderstood. But since there are rules through nature given to this work, eventually it will be understood because those rules will become those that everybody recognizes as the right rules or as rules in themselves. But the genius is this kind of historical being because they're out of their own time, and in some ways this is the whole romantic becomes, all the romantic poets I can name now are all these people. Half of them misunderstood, half of them forgotten, and then 200 years later they are the greatest artists. So there's a kind of strange dimension how it opens up historical time in a completely strange way. So when you said earlier he is a historical thinker in his moment, but the categories he uses allow us to think that we're not caught and trapped in this moment in 1784 in the Enlightenment. We're not caught, but actually he allows you to think about work in a much broader sense. I do think about this experience when you go to the theater. I went to the theater recently and I saw a play, a widely acclaimed play, and I'm sitting in a theater with 900 people, and I thought it was just one long cliche in a bad sense. And it was a very alienating experience. I didn't enjoy it. I didn't think, oh, I'm superior to these people. I actually felt really, I didn't share this common sense of pleasure in a beautiful product. I thought, it was very isolated, not in a way that, oh, I get it, they don't get it. No, I thought, what is wrong with me?
Oh, really?
Yes.
But sometimes you could think reverse.
No, I didn't like it. I didn't like this experience. I thought it should be a very long German word for that experience. Displeasure or not feeling part of the sensus communis or something like that, you know. So to go back to one other thing here is, did you, your glasses?
I lost my glasses. I can do without them, that's okay.
There's something else where he says that people who have positions, there your glasses.
Thank you.
People who have a position.
I knew I was gesticulating too much. I always do.
Should exercise their jobs like officers or soldiers or tax collectors. They can have strong opinions, or the priest even can have strong opinions on the doctrine of the church. But Kant somehow says we are capable of doing our jobs while we can publish works questioning all the principles. We are we are implementing. This split seemed really complicated to me.
I'm not sure what you're
You could
talking
have a
about.
job and you could be a priest and you you conduct a service every Sunday, but you can write a book and say, I'm questioning all the premises of the church.
And even the priest could do that.
Yeah.
So
That
as long
seems-
as he's preaching, he should, he has an institutional role
Yes.
and should be in the role.
Yes.
But outside his preaching, he's free to.
And he seems to say even he's free, and also it's a good thing. Actually,
And it's a
that
good
he's
thing.
exercising his
That's what
reason
he
in this
should do.
public way, and he should write these, and he should write books.
Right. Yeah.
It's a very. It seemed to me a kind of precarious distinction between the public function of your job as a private person, you're writing things, but for the public.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know. I know people. Maybe I have a blind spot myself. I do see the problems that can arise, and of course, in times of shift in a society, they do arise. But I can kind of make sense of the view, because look at the examples he gives: the tax collector, the officer in an army, and so the more complicated one is the priest, indeed. But that the tax collector, his role is to be a tax collector. He's going to collect the taxes. Similarly for the officer. And then outside his function, he is a citizen. Now, of course, it's not that simple, because a tax collector who then goes on and writes a book against taxes, he's going to have problems. It's not going to be that easy.
Right.
I think the example he really has in mind is the case of the priest, because there was, of course, that fairly commonly shared view among Enlightenment people, including Enlightenment priests like Kant's friend Zollner, who is the originator of that footnote. And by the way, nobody has been able to tell me what Enlightenment is.
And he said the Enlightenment is going too far, right?
And he said there that the Enlightenment was going too far, because some young, enthusiastic Enlightenment guy had said, oh, we don't need priests to officiate in weddings. And even perhaps the institution of marriage should be abolished altogether. And then Zollner said, oh, wait.
Too much
don't go that far.
Enlightenment.
Okay. But nevertheless, even for people like Zollner, there was this view that the truth of religion is a moral truth. And Kant's view was, well, if a priest thinks that the truths of religion are moral truths, and religion should be assessed from a moral standpoint, he has a right to write it. He doesn't have a right to preach it. So I agree with you. At some point, if he really writes the book, he may also be led to have to.
But do you think it comes out of a sense that Kant says, if he wrote anything different, it says you're a priest, you kind of check your beliefs at the door, you never talk about them, it would not be recognizing, it would turn people into sort of robots and not allow this humanity, which he considers so central. So in some ways, if he had said, well, you can think for yourself, but if you're a tax collector, you cannot have another thought. You cannot be critical, what we call critical thinking. So in some ways, it would be
well, as a tax collector, that's what he says, In your role as a tax collector.
You collect taxes all day,
you go
but
and
then
collect your
at
taxes.
5 o'clock when you're done, you can write a book and question the whole system, right? But in some ways, if you didn't allow for that, is there a worry in Kant, then you fail on these other things and you don't recognize the capacity, the human capacity, or you use people only as a means, because then they're only tax collectors. And ultimately, it goes against the entire idea, then you're only a tax collector. So I have to keep that space open for you. You're also an end in yourself. And you may have very different opinions. I mean, it's interesting, and it's a question that's with us. I mean, actually, we're living in a country right now where we have military officials saying things, and the president, who has executive power, says something different, and we don't know, but they will be fired, they will not be fired. Do they have the right to say certain things? They cannot question an order, but can they question the principles, or is the order in accordance with the principles? I mean, we've had this through the history of modernity, whether there's such a thing as war crimes, whether a soldier can actually do something on his own act, and then he can be sentenced for it because he was exercising the wrong judgment. So Kant's principles would allow something to parse these kinds of difficult questions.
Right. No, that's true. I still find it. I mean, so he's actually quite complex in his description, because he says, however, if a priest thought that what he's asked to preach by his church is actually contrary to his assessment, then he has no choice but to
quit.
He should quit.
He should quit.
Yeah.
He should quit.
So it's not. So he does think that there are elements that are relatively neutral, that are just, they're part of the community's sort of culture. So you can you can preach them as long as they do not go against your moral assessment of the religion. And that's exactly, that's how he systematizes his own view in the later text, Religion Within the Boundaries of Reason Alone, where he said, okay, there are those doctrines, they're okay, and they have this more fundamental truth that sort of is we should really care about.
But what I like in sort of the work, your work on judgment and this kind of the difference between speaking from the I as a personal position and a universal position, and then this example right now about the priest, there's a moment when the priest should quit. Because he can't reconcile his criticism with the doctrine of the church with what he has to do. It goes against a more fundamental, and it's not that it goes against a fundamental personal preference or prejudice, but it goes against the categories you laid out much earlier of these steps in how to think for yourself, which are several steps. It's not just, I have this opinion, this goes against the opinion. And what I like in your work, that Kant can appear as a kind of so principled, and there's three steps and there's categories, and I said it looks dry, but actually it animates these things we live through every day. That they actually animate and awaken in us to say, I can actually make sense of this, rather than I have to appeal to some rigid set of rules. And I think there's a way in which Kant can come across as being rigid, but what you're saying, it opens up this capacity to think, when I say I, do I speak for myself? Do I speak on behalf of of sort of a universal morality?
And of course, in many, many cases, you just speak for, if I say, I'm sitting here, I'm speaking for myself and nobody else. So this tension between the particular and the universal, it occurs in very specific cases. I think this is true. I ought to do this. What's really striking in those two cases is that I think this is true is most individually about me. I've made the effort of assessing the reasons. But because I've made the effort of assessing the reasons, in saying I think, I also make a claim on others to examine in the same way and realize that, yes, they ought to think that too. Same thing for I ought to. I ought not to break a promise. But you shouldn't either. In this case, this is true under a principle that holds for all.
And this is what you lay out. That's sort of when you say, I think this is true, it's not saying I am right based on because it's me. But you're saying, I think it's true because I've done the work to understand how I arrived at this conclusion. And this re-examination is kind of to go back on yourself and say, I'm going to look at myself now, not just as having a preference. I want to ask you a totally different question. How did you get into, you said your example was, I don't know if it was your example that the moon could fall or something. It's like, how did you discover Kant as your philosophical hero?
How did I discover? I think first actually through the philosophy of science.
Really?
Yeah. So I mean there's a very autobiographical thing here. So I was trained in France. I prepared for the École Normale Supérieure exam. And we had the transcendental aesthetic in the program. And so I studied Kant's theory of space and time and its relation to the science of the time. And I found it completely fascinating. That's how I really got into Kant. And I discovered...
To the science of his period, the 17th.
Through his interest in science. And it's funny because I'm just thinking that, trying to answer your question, I think in my own biography, I had kind of the same transition as Kant had. So Kant said, until I discovered Rousseau, I thought science was what was most important. And then I discovered Rousseau, so he discovered Rousseau. I think shortly after Rousseau published L'Émile and The Social Contract.
So this is 1760s?
So L'Émile was, I think, 1758, Social Contract 1762, and Kant said that in 1764. So he read it really. No, French was all over. The French culture was the culture of Frederick the Great's Berlin. So they all read French Enlightenment. As it were, they
imported the Enlightenment from France and Geneva.
And he says, when I discovered Rousseau, I discovered that he had already had thoughts about the universality of moral values, but he thought they were based on feeling. And then he discovers Rousseau, and he says, discovering Rousseau made me think, no, the most important is human dignity. And for me, in a way, when you ask, how did you enter Kant? For me, it was first the philosophy of science. And so, actually, to be completely honest, I was never that much into Kant's moral philosophy, because I myself have some reservations. So, I don't know. I have some reservations about what I took to be. I'm also getting back on that, actually. What I talk to be the formal universalistic formalism of Kant's universalist claims. I think my itinerary was kind of circular. I discovered Kant's philosophy of science, then I became interested in Hegel. And being interested in Hegel, I went back to Kant and have this more complex approach to Kant, not just as the philosopher of science.
But it's nice that it's like a moment of Rousseau for him.
Yeah, and for him it's a moment of Rousseau.
I mean, what's remarkable at the early works that he writes about everything. And that today you think that anybody would write about just about everything. The cosmos, science, morality, politics, everything. It's rare to have people like that.
No, it doesn't. So in that sense too, Kant is a man of the Enlightenment. The French Enlightenment people, they were the encyclopedists.
Right.
Yes, we should have an approach to all aspects of human experience and the productions of human reasons and what human reason as a capacity can accomplish. And we have kind of lost some of that,
It's interesting, we have lost some of this because we do compartmentalize so much. And we think someone does this and someone does that. Yeah. And what this text kind of, it's such an ambitious thing to think for yourself in all these different areas.
Yeah.
Which I always thought is also the essence of education in a way, that this, in German these words are pretty much Aufklärung is sort of an interesting word. It just means elucidation, or that's what you do in teaching. Right, but I always thought teaching is the awakening in someone else of their capacity to think, not giving them information. Yeah.
Now, and that's also a point Kant stresses here. What's important is not to give information; is to teach people to think for themselves.
Right. Is there a favorite text that you have? Because I gave you the littlest text, this little sliver, but it just had this afterlife. It's amazing that this text has, everybody has responded to this. And is there a favorite Kant that you've gone back to? As a text that you think is a good entry
into Kant?
Yeah, gateway drug or something like that. The critiques, I think, are very daunting. No, I think in general, for people who want to, let's say, take the step after this short little text, they read this, what's the next thing you should read? The Metaphysics of Morals or the...
I think they should just read the Critique of Pure Reason.
Read the Critique of Pure Reason.
Even Start there. And actually, again, so one has this vision of the Critique of Pure Reason, and it is, of course, it's true, this huge systematic text.
Right.
But it starts with claims that are very much like this. Our age is the age of critique. Nothing should escape critique. Not the religious powers, not the legislative powers, not the political powers. Our age is the age of examination by reason. Now, the Critique of Furion is a daunting text, and I wouldn't recommend anyone I would recommend anyone try to read it alone, but I teach it. I teach it to young people,
I think so.
And they're enthusiastic about it. They, when you think, and I even have a story to tell you. So I have a colleague is it a son or a daughter? It's a son, who's applying to college now. And he was with a friend. I won't say through which town because I don't want to give too much away. But anyway, he was walking in the street and they come upon a bookstore, and the friend tells him, "Look, this book, everything is in it." And it was the Critique of Furion.
Really?
So I would recommend just try what's hard.
Yeah.
Try what's hard, but okay, if you want something more accessible and that gives you a better sense of, and it's important too, definitely, and it's too much ignored, of Kant's attention to history and to his time, I would say read the texts on history. Idea of a universal history from a cosmopolitan standpoint, and you will be impressed by some of what is said and sort of...
I think you will be impressed how relevant it is, and you will see this is a thought of the early 90s or something like that determined the course of history. So it's these strange texts that actually play themselves out, and you can say he's writing, it's a visionary ideal of something that never gets implemented, but he says at the same time the world works, how someone can see as if they can shape the future or just see the future. It's kind of interesting. Yeah.
And exactly contemporary to that text, and actually to the text on Enlightenment, the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. Yeah. That's what most people start Kant with.
Right.
And yes, it's a very fascinating text.
Right. Well, Béatrice, I want to thank you. Really, really, really wonderful. And
I'm
grateful that you read the small little text and you gave me the whole...
And there's so much more to say.
There's a lot more to say. Goethe said something, when you read Kant, you step into a well-lit cathedral. Yeah, there's many quotes, less flattering ones by the German philosophers. Right? But I really like the way you elucidated these principles and concepts. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Great. Okay, cool. Thank you.